Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Colin McLeod, and I'm a professor at the University of Melbourne and also the Executive Director of the University's Melbourne Entrepreneurial Centre. Welcome to the 2020 Menzies Oration. It's virtual this year, so it's different. But being virtual does mean that we're able to deliver this year's oration to over 1,000 people locally and internationally. So welcome to you all. As you know, being a webinar, it does have a few limitations. So one of those is, unfortunately, I can't see any of you, but I do have two dogs, a cat, and an eclectus parrot to give me feedback at my home. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. When you think of the topic of tonight's oration, creativity with constraints, I wonder if anyone has been more creative while facing more constraints than the first Australians. Australia is the driest continent. There are no native animals capable of being domesticated, no native grains capable of supporting agriculture. And we're home to some of the world's deadliest animals on land and sea. And the first Australians also faced a 1,500-year drought and a mini ice age. But to the first Australians, these weren't constraints. They were the raw material from which they've created art, science, language, and music, and built the most sophisticated, supportive, peaceful, and enduring culture in human history. And unfortunately, the words sophisticated, supportive, peaceful, and enduring, along with culture, aren't many words that we hear spoken together these days. So in the spirit of creativity with constraints, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to extend that respect to any First Nations people with us today. The Menzies Oration is an annual event hosted by the University of Melbourne and the Menzies Foundation. And I'd now like to introduce Professor Duncan Maskell, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, who would like to add his welcome.
Hello and welcome to this year's Menzies Oration. Thank you, Colin, for the introduction and for that insightful reflection on the creativity of First Nations people, something we can and should continuously learn from. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which the university and its several campuses stand, the Wurundjeri people, the Boonwurrung people, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and the Yorta Yorta peoples. I also pay my respects to Indigenous elders across Australia, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge all Indigenous people viewing this today. I am sorry that we can't be physically present with each other, but it is my pleasure to be able to speak on behalf of the university to welcome everyone to the 2020 Menzies Oration. This important oration has taken place annually since 1991 and honours the long-standing relationship between the Menzies Foundation and the University of Melbourne. We all regret the difficult circumstances imposed on us by COVID-19 this year, but how impressive it has been to see so many people across society, including in universities, adapting to these circumstances with extraordinary creativity and flair. And this is something I'm sure we'll learn more about in this year's oration. Historically, the Menzies Foundation and the University of Melbourne have come together each year with a mutual commitment to education and leadership. Each year, the Foundation and the University find a fresh focus area with an outstanding guest orator whose deep knowledge in that area can help make a substantial new contribution to the Australian conversation on leadership. And that brings me to our speaker today, Dr. Tina Seelig, a professor at Stanford University with expertise in creative entrepreneurial leadership. Dr. Seelig is a world-renowned expert in this field, whose career in academia and as a best-selling author has shed light on creative approaches to innovation and entrepreneurialism. Colin will introduce Dr. Seelig in a moment, but I wanted to also extend my welcome to her on behalf of the university, and I am looking forward to her address on creativity with constraints. This is a great topic. We have all had to learn completely new ways of being creative throughout the course of this year, and we'll have to continue doing so in years to come. So on behalf of the university, I welcome Dr. Seelig's insights and expertise and thank her for taking the time to speak to us today. I also thank the Menzies Foundation and the Melbourne Entrepreneurial Centre at the University of Melbourne for making this year's unprecedented online Menzies Oration possible. And on that note, I will hand back to our MC, Colin McLeod. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Duncan. One of the preparatory events for tonight's oration was a workshop led by Professor Seelig last week with participants drawn from across the university, as well as the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research. I'm now going to hand over to Liz Gillies, the CEO of the Menzies Foundation, to also welcome you to the oration and tell you a little bit more about the workshop.
Hi, I'm Liz Gillies, CEO of the Menzies Foundation. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which the Menzies Foundation stands, the Boonwurrung people, and their elders past and present. Like the Vice-Chancellor, I too regret that we cannot be together today, but we are delighted to be able to partner with the University of Melbourne to offer the Menzies 2020 oration as a webinar. The Menzies Foundation aspires to raise the profile and importance of outstanding leadership, building on the legacy of Sir Robert Menzies. We do this by identifying challenges and by building incubators to address those challenges systemically. The challenges of 2020 have certainly been considerable. New ways of thinking are required and needed to respond to the many and varied problems generated by COVID-19 and to generate creative new solutions. Our 2020 Menzies Orator, Professor Tina Seelig, is a true world leader in creativity, innovation and entrepreneurship. Last week, she hosted a pre-oration workshop with over 40 aspiring innovators and entrepreneurs. Even Zoom couldn't diminish Tina's incredible energy as she took participants through her unique model for seizing opportunities and generating new perspectives to identify and solve problems. Tina inspires game-changing thinking, no matter where she is or how she's sharing this knowledge. We're truly privileged to have Tina here today delivering the Menzies Oration live from Stanford University in the United States. I'll now pass you back to Professor Colin McLeod to introduce Tina. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks, Liz. Tina and I caught up at Stanford in January this year. At the time, it was about 9 weeks to the original date of the Menzies Oration. It's now 9 months and a very different world later. So I am very pleased to finally be able to say I am delighted to invite Professor Seelig to deliver the 2020 Menzies Oration.
Hello, everyone. It is a delight to be here. We are certainly living in times with enormous constraints. We are living in a time where we can't go out. We're all locked down. We can't go to the office. We can't meet our friends. And in fact, with all the smoke that we had here in California recently, and I know that you're familiar with this in Australia, we couldn't even go outside. So I'm going to share my slides with you and get going with a talk on creativity with constraints. Super. So one thing to keep in mind is that we have constraints all the time. Constraints are not just something that we have now. They're things that happen every day of our life. We never have everything that we need to get to the places that we want to go. And we need to think about how we can look at those constraints as a source of inspiration. In fact, I would argue that the constraints that we have now really have pushed us out of our comfort zone and forced us to question everything. And it allows us to start seeing how we can look at constraints, not as a source of limitation, but as a source of inspiration. So let's start with a puzzle that many of you might be familiar with. It's the 9-dot puzzle, where your challenge is to connect all 9 of these dots with at most 4 lines without lifting your pen or pencil from the paper. Now, the way that this is typically done is to think outside the box. Think outside the box. In fact, this is where the term think outside the box came from. It came from this puzzle where you have to think outside the constraints of the puzzle in order to solve the problem. But what if your constraints are so tight that you aren't allowed to leave the box? Just as we haven't even been allowed to leave our houses. What if you need to look inside that box and look at what you actually do have as opposed to what you don't have? So I'm going to give you a bunch of examples through time, through history, through disciplines of places where constraints have really stimulated creativity. And I'm going to end with some stories from last week with a workshop that I ran with the students from the University of Melbourne and the Menzies Foundation. So let's start with a very memorable example of Apollo 13. Now, I was alive during that time, the Apollo 13 disaster, and many of you might remember it as well. And if you haven't, I certainly encourage you to watch the movie Apollo 13. This is a true story where in 1970, the astronauts were on their way to the moon, and one of the oxygen tanks blew up. Not only did it threaten the mission, but it threatened the lives of all the people on that spaceship. The oxygen started decreasing, the carbon dioxide started increasing, and they were so unprepared for anything like this that they didn't even have the tools or the resources to fix it on this capsule. So there's a scene in the movie that is so memorable where they throw a bunch of things on the table. These are all the things that they actually do have, not the things they want to have. There are things like the user's manuals for some of the equipment, some extra space suits, all sorts of other odds and ends, and say, you need to solve this problem with these limited resources you have. And with these limited resources, certainly limited time, and with lives on the line, they were able to tap into these constraints to solve this problem and to bring the astronauts home safely. Now you can look at examples that are not as dire, where constraints have unlocked creativity. One of my favorite examples comes from Monty Python. Many of you are probably familiar with these comedy group, and in one of their favorite films, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, they had a wonderful script and they had very little resources. Their budget was so low that when they looked at the script, they said, there's no way that we can do many of these things. In fact, one of the most famous scenes in the movie comes from their creativity with constraints. Written into the script was a knight coming over a hill on a big, beautiful stallion. They said, there's no way we can afford a stallion. We can't even afford a pony. What can we do? And they looked around and they said, what resources do we have that might be able to emulate a horse, a stallion? And they ended up clapping 2 coconuts together and making the sound of horses' hooves. And this ended up becoming not just a solution that solved their budgetary problems, but also ended up becoming one of the funniest scenes in all of Monty Python history. So you can go back in time and see that constraints have been used for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands, to unlock creativity. Let's go back about 400 years for haiku. And haiku, as most of you know, is a very structured poem that is 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second, and 5 syllables in the last line. Very tight constraint. In fact, the poem is also constrained is that it is supposed to have a theme around nature, and there's supposed to be a hidden meaning or a meta message about life and the universe that is captured in this very tiny poem. One of my favorite examples is also a very, very famous haiku, comes from 400 years ago. It's called The Old Pond. And it's a beautiful poem. In fact, I was looking at it earlier today and I thought, gosh, this poem is so resonant with the way we probably are feeling in the world. It is an old silent pond. A frog jumps into the pond. Splash. Silence again. And maybe all of us, 2020 has been a year with a lot of frogs jumping into the pond. Hopefully we'll at some point have silence again. So let's come a little bit more recent times than haiku 400 years ago. Let's look at Ernest Hemingway, who was given the challenge to tell his life story in only 6 words. He was told, can you tell us your memoir in only this little tiny space? He thought for a second and said, sure. And his memoir is, or was, For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Born. A very sad tale indeed. So if you look around, you can easily find lots of examples of 6-word memoirs. People have been using this art form to tell their story. This is one that I like. I'm disabled, but not helpless. Another, Stuck on Repeat. Stuck on repeat. Hobby became job, seeking new hobby. it's funny, I was thinking about what would my 6-word memoir be. I find that you can tell a different one every single day, depending on what's going on. My one for today, I realized, was drinking from a fire hose. Oh my goodness, what was that? I ended up drinking from a fire hose as usual. So that was mine for today. And I was thinking that maybe you guys could think about what sort of 6-word memoir you might want to have. You could come more recent to Twitter, where so many of us think about how can we capture the messages we want to share with the world in under only 140 characters. When this new tool, social networking platform, came out, a lot of people thought this was a crazy idea, but others found incredible creativity with this constraint. One of my favorite examples is a woman who always wrote recipes on Twitter, only using 140 characters. Imagine an entire cookbook filled with 140 character recipes. This actually really inspired me. When the COVID crisis started and we ended up on lockdown, we had a tremendous opportunity to think about how could we solve problems in a brand new way. And I went to work trying to come up with all sorts of ways that I could teach in a way that took advantage of these very unusual constraints that we had that I'd never thought of before. And I came up with an idea of teaching an entire course using just tweets, doing a month of tiny tweets that would be an entire course. And in fact, I'm happy to share a website I put together with all of them if you want to see them all. Here was the first tweet that introduced this concept. Join me for a series of bite-sized classes called Jolts, delivered only via tweets. Each Jolt will include a short video, so a link to a short video and a tiny assignment, and all video clips are taken from our collection, the Stanford collection that we have on eCorner. So this was really fun. I wanted to see what would happen. Here is one of the classes I taught, one of my tweets. It was actually on creativity with constraints. This was Jolt number 8. Here it is, a classic clip with Marissa Mayer, who is at that point was at Google. And the clip is about how she uses constraints to stimulate creativity in her problem solving. And the homework for students was to look around and see what constraints they have now and how that was stimulating their creativity. One of the responses to this was this one from one of the people who participated in this online course. I can no longer travel and meet fascinating people, but tons of fascinating people offer webinars, just like this, hopefully, and talks on Zoom and other platforms. In all honesty, I've never met so many interesting people as I do now, which inspires me to become more interesting myself. So that was one of the submissions. I have a lot of experience teaching with constraints. I've been teaching for the last 6 years at San Quentin State Prison. I teach in a program there called The Last Mile. This is a program where the men at San Quentin Prison, and now people, men and women in prisons around the country, are learned how to code. The idea is that if they understand how to code, they really develop these skills when they get out of prison, they're going to have real job opportunities and something that's going to help them make a living and will have a much lower chance of ending up getting back into a life of crime. So I actually met the woman who runs this and her husband on an airplane many years ago. And we stayed fast friends after that conversation. And a few years later, I said, you know what, I'd really like to volunteer. And so I started teaching entrepreneurship to the men in the Last Mile program. So in addition to learning how to code, they are also learning entrepreneurship so they can marry those skills together when they come out and really start thinking about how could they build businesses using these skills. So what do I teach them? I teach them how to do first need finding. I give them a prompt. The prompt might be something like sleep or memory or wildfires or time. They have to then interview each other and other people in their community about this topic. They then have to frame a problem based on the interviews they've done. They then brainstorm to come up with at least 100 ideas, 100 solutions to that problem. They then have to pick a few of those to test, and then they have to pick their favorite idea and tell a story. Tell a story in a video about this project. So the last time I did this, I took it to the next level, and I actually decided to do a class that bridged San Quentin Prison and Stanford University. And I had 16 Stanford students and 16 men in prison in the class. And we created a live link between Stanford University and the prison. And each week we met together, and 4 times the students went up to the prison to work on the project with the men, because they were on teams with them. There were 4 people on each team, 2 men from the prison and 2 of the students. This was a truly remarkable and life-changing experience for everyone. And the project I gave them was wildfires. Now, why did I pick wildfires? Not only were we all suffering together, but the men in prison, this was particularly meaningful to them. A, during the fires, they can't escape the smoke. They're really trapped. 2, they have many family members who are living in places that are affected by the fires. And 3, many of the men in the prison actually fight alongside the firefighters. They fight the fires, and they become trained to help them. And this has become incredibly invaluable in putting out these blazes. So in this project, many of the teams came up with very interesting problems to solve. How might we prevent wildfires? How might we detect them early? How might we help people escape if they are stuck in an area where a wildfire is coming their way? So at the end of their project, I said, all right, these are really terrific. You've come up with amazing ideas. Now you need to make a video that tells the story of your project in 1 minute or less. And they looked at me like I was crazy. They said, what are you talking about? We can't make a video. We don't have cameras. We don't have video equipment. We don't have editing tools. We don't even have access to the internet. And I said, you know what? Creativity loves constraints. I'm going to be back in 2 weeks, and I bet you're going to all figure out a way to make these videos. They looked around, a couple people, their minds started going and saying, you know, I think we can figure it out. And I'm going to share with you one of the videos that came out of this project that truly, truly blew my socks off. To this day, I have no idea how they actually did it, but they pulled it off, and I'm delighted to share it with you. Pretty amazing. I love the email address, you're on fire at whatever it is, .com. So anyway, this was quite an amazing project, and I left feeling totally inspired, and the men walked out feeling incredibly empowered that even with the constraints they had, they can do something truly remarkable. The fact is, creativity is often used to stimulate the imagination. I love this quote from the artist Phil Hansen, and if you haven't seen his TED Talk, I truly, truly recommend it. He wrote here in his quote, we need to first be limited before we become limitless. Now, why is it that he said this? Well, he was a remarkable artist, and his medium was pointillism, where he made little tiny dots and incredibly detailed pictures. Until one day, he'd been doing this so much, he ended up with a tremor in his hand that wouldn't stop. And he went to doctors, and they said, there's nothing we can do. You need to embrace the shake. And he thought, how can I do that? So he ended up changing the way he did art completely. Here's an example of one of the things he did. This is all with stamps. He started using a ton of other tools, to create art that didn't require him to make these little dots, but allowed him to do tremendously diverse and really, really creative things. And I would argue that the work that he has done after he had this constraint is so much more interesting than the work he did before he had it. Many of us have been inspired to do art over the course of the last 7 months when we've been in lockdown. In fact, the Getty Museum put out a challenge soon after the coronavirus hit and we were all on quarantine. They said, can you replicate some of the art at the Getty Museum using things you have around the house? And so some of my friends who started doing Zoom cocktail parties decided that we would try to do this ourselves. And so we just took on the challenge. One of my friends replicated Whistler's mother. I thought she did an amazing job. Of course, noticed the Corona bottle of beer in her hand. This is her daughter who replicated a painting of Frida Kahlo. Here is Wayne Thiebaud's pastries made with face masks. And here is Sunflowers by Van Gogh, all done with things that you can find around the house. Pretty clever. In fact, people around the world figured out ways to make music when they were separated. Scientists have figured out how to collaborate at a distance and figure out ways to solve, the big problems that we're facing. It's important to keep in mind, though, that there are different types of constraints. They come in all different flavors and sizes. There are constraints on the input. Things like, okay, how much money you have, how much time do you have, what people are there that are your resources on your team, what materials you might have, what space you have available, right? They're the inputs that you have. There's the process, okay? Do you have to do something with one hand tied behind your back? Do you have to use a particular tool? Do you only have a hammer and not a screwdriver? Is there a particular methodology that you're required to use? And then of course, there's the output. Are you constrained by saying, well, the product you make has to fit in someone's back pocket. The product you make or the service you offer has to cost less than $10. So you need to think about the constraints on the input, the constraints on the process, and the constraints on the output. And we could look back on the stories and examples I've given you over the last few minutes, and you can see which ones were input constraints, what were process constraints, and what were output constraints. But I love this framework, which I've modified from some work from Teresa Amabile from Harvard, modified it just a little bit to look at how constraints can be stimulating, but how they can also be inhibiting. We need to keep in mind constraints aren't always there ramping up our creativity. There are times when you have very high constraints and high creativity, like the beginning of our lockdown periods, where everyone was on a mission. Honestly, I was like a crazy person, coming up with jolts, coming up with pop-up classes, coming up with all different ways that I could try to solve a problem. I was on a mission to help people who were suffering as a result of the coronavirus. But once things go on longer and longer and longer, high constraints end up leading into low creativity. You can start feeling like you're on a treadmill. You get fatigued and you say, I can't put up with this stress any longer. This is getting too hard. But there are ways to think about situations where you have high creativity with low constraints. Think about being on an expedition. Let's say you're on vacation somewhere. You have nothing planned, you have nothing to do, you're out taking pictures, you're on an expedition, and you might be very, very creative in that situation. But you can also be in a situation where low constraints lead to low creativity. You could be on autopilot. Think about people who have jobs. It might be a very repetitive job where there are no constraints, but they end up feeling not very creative at all. So it's important when you're designing environments where you want to stimulate creativity to think about how are you going to get people to feel like they're on a mission as opposed to feeling like they're on a treadmill. How can you make them feel like they're on an expedition as opposed to being on autopilot? And how can you use the levers of the inputs, the process, and the outputs to end up stimulating that creativity? Well, this is what I do in lots of my classes and what I got a chance to do with the participants from Melbourne last week. I gave them, just like I gave the men at San Quentin, a one-word prompt. It was actually, I kind of cheated a little bit. It was a little bit of a three-word prompt because the prompt was online learning, but I thought that's kind of like a one-word concept. And by the way, where did I get this idea of a one-word prompt? It came from, I was inspired because I read about the one-word exam that used to be given at Oxford University. At Oxford University, they used to give an exam, an entrance exam, where all the applicants would be given one word. And the word could be anything. It could be persistence. It could be integrity. It could be water. And they had to write for 3 hours using that one word as a prompt. And the idea was to see how the constraint of that one word helped them unlock their creativity, thinking about how they could weave together the things they knew, their ideas they had, into some interesting narrative. So the one word prompt, as I said, that I gave the folks last week was online learning. And the first thing that they needed to do was to interview each other. I put them in small groups where they interviewed each other about online learning, what was working well, what doesn't, what wasn't, and they had to come away with some observations and some insights about online learning. So here is a snapshot of the whiteboard we created in our Zoom meeting with the things that they wrote that were the observations and the insights about online learning. There are things like there are no geographical barriers or boundaries, just like here I am. I'm in California, you guys are in Australia, yet we're able to communicate. But there's no after-class community. It's hard to build hype and excitement, but it's also easy to make appointments. So there are lots of things they came up with as problems and opportunities and insights and observations. I then told them, okay, your next challenge is to frame properly a question around these problems. Because one of the most important things you can do is to frame a problem in a thoughtful way. This is what I spend a tremendous amount of time with my students doing them, help them frame a problem in a way that's gonna allow them to unlock really, really important questions. So they had to do questions such as, how might we some action for a particular audience in order to solve a particular problem? So here's the screen with the salute questions that they came up with. Here are some of them. How might we create a more equal education system for all K-12 students in order to address the resource gap, right? Resource gap, of course, when we're online, some people have great access, others don't. How might we better engage students during online learning? How might we be able to help video users normalize virtual problem solving, right? How can we do problem solving when we're living in this virtual world? How might we facilitate interpersonal out of classroom communication, especially among first-year students? So once they came up with all of their problems, I sent them back to their groups to come up with as many solutions as they could. But I gave them another constraint. The solutions they came up with had to be horrible ideas. Now you're wondering, why would I want them to come up with the horrible ideas? Well, I have to tell you, good ideas end up usually being incremental. They're incremental, they're expected. If I asked you to come up with the best idea for a vacation or a new restaurant, you'd come up with things like a vacation, on a beautiful cruise, going to Disneyland. You know, a restaurant, you'd say, it's gonna have lovely food and be on the top of a mountain with a gorgeous view. But if I ask you to come up with terrible ideas, you're gonna come up with things that are truly unexpected. So the next screen is some of the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad ideas that the participants came up with. Things like make everyone turn off their videos, have fire lecturers with pre-recorded material, fine folks, it's fine, let's say I'm getting lost. You have to do 10 push-ups for every minute you're late. I like this one. The highest mark students gets the lowest marks grade. Okay, so it meant that, the person who's doing the best in the class Well, guess what? Whatever the lowest student's getting, they get that grade. Machines that buzz if you're not using it properly. Electric shocks are administered if you're not paying attention. Everyone sings for 30 seconds at the beginning of the meeting. Well, then what we did is I said, you need to take these horrible ideas and turn them into something brilliant. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. We had a discussion where they were able to look at these terrible ideas through the lens of possibilities, coming up with ideas that were truly remarkable. In fact, we decided the idea that the highest marked student gets the lowest grade would be fabulous. It gives everyone an incentive to help everybody do better, because guess what? Everyone's essentially going to end up with the same grade. So you raise the bar for the whole class. We decided it was a great idea for everyone to sing at the beginning of class. In fact, in most of my classes, I always start out with music and a little bit of dancing. I think you saw that in the video that was showed at the beginning. Everyone dancing around gets everyone in the right mood and wakes everyone up a little bit before you get started. So we found a tremendous number of great ideas, and I think people walked away realizing that the constraints I gave them of that idea ended up unlocking some truly remarkable ideas. I love this quote from Proust. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in seeing with new eyes. And this is really important. It's about looking at the world through the lens of possibilities, as opposed to looking at what you don't have and looking to seeking new places. Look at what you do have and see the possibilities there. The fact is, the world is full of constraints. And if we look at them through the lens of possibilities, they allow us to unlock an entire world of imagination. Thank you very, very much. And I am delighted to answer questions. I think that there are some that are waiting for me.
They are indeed, Tina. And thank you for your presentation as the starting point for most of these questions. So the first question is, can creative processes stagnate? Is it something you need to keep on practicing? And are there any ways of overcoming creative stagnation?
Creative stagnation, are there ways to, yeah, I think that it's really important to shake yourself up. In fact, I do believe that the very quick constraints that we ended up with during the lockdown has really forced people to think differently about their lives and to figure out ways. First of all, they realize what's really, really important. You know, quickly early on, so many people said, gosh, I need to see my friends. And everybody started putting together these virtual cocktail hours. The interesting thing that fell out of that is that you realize that there were friends you could have seen all along going online, but you didn't do it, right? I don't know other many people who are watching felt that way, but I felt like there were people who I never saw before. Now I was seeing them every week as a result of the fact that these constraints allowed us to truly embrace the possibilities that we have in front of us.
The second question is, are a lot of our constraints self-imposed? Do we stop ourselves from being more creative?
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you a little better. Great. I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, sure. Are a lot of our constraints around creativity self-imposed? Do we stop ourselves from being more creative?
Absolutely. And I truly believe this. I teach classes on creativity and innovation, and many students walk in and say, you know what, I'm not really creative. And I say, you got to be kidding. We're all creative. You know, they're waiting though for an environment that invites it. Let me tell you a little bit of a story. A few years ago, actually, you could probably tell me what year it was. A number of years ago, I was giving a talk in Japan. And it was right after the tsunami and the nuclear power meltdown. And people felt very, very bad about the situation in Japan. And I went there to go run a creative workshop because I was challenged. I was told, oh, these kids here in Japan, they're not very creative. And I said, come on, that is just not the case. Of course they are. So I went there and they were feeling really bad. And I said, okay, your challenge is to create as much. I did a 2-hour workshop. It was very, very minimal intervention on my part. 2-hour workshop. And at the end I said, your challenge is to create as much value as possible, value measured any way you like, starting with the contents of a trash can. Now, why did I pick a trash can? Because a trash can has negative value. You pay people to take it away. And the things these students did blew my socks off. They were incredible. They walked away afterwards saying they had no idea how creative they were. But the reason they didn't think they were creative is because they had not been given the opportunity to be creative. And I think one of the biggest problems is our education system. In so many places, we give exams with one right answer, multiple choice tests. It means it's easy to grade, but it doesn't allow you to be creative. And so our school system is designed to essentially squeeze the creativity out of you. But if you gave open-ended problems with no one right answer, like creating value from the contents of a trash can, all of a sudden it unlocks those potential. So absolutely, I am completely convinced that just like any other skill, math, science, reading, history, sports, the more you practice, the better you get.
It's very interesting that you mentioned about students and the way they study. One of the questions, I should give you a very brief bit of background. There's a very active political debate going on at the moment about the funding of different types of degrees. And the arts and humanities are about to become close to the most expensive degrees at our public universities. And of course, a lot of people are concerned that people will lose the ability around creative thinking, critical analysis, and all those sorts of things. So I know it's a bit of an awkward one because it is a political situation. You haven't been fully briefed on the background of that. But if someone came to you and said, look, the price of doing humanities degrees or arts degrees is about to go up significantly, what would be your response?
So I have several thoughts on this. I mean, the budget issue is a very interesting one, but the question of exposure to these different disciplines, each of these disciplines is like a language. So there's the language of science and the language of art and the language of history. And what you're really doing is, if you're not teaching these courses, is you're really getting rid of that language. And we think differently in different languages. And that's why we use physics to solve certain types of problems and math to solve certain problems. And we use science to solve other problems because the language of those disciplines allows us to address very, very different things. So I would say, think deeply about whether you want to eliminate or create constraints around participating in these fields, because these fields are just as valuable as any of the others.
Thank you. In your best-selling book, What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20, is there one thing that you really, really would have liked to have known when you were 20?
Oh my goodness, there's so much. I wrote a whole book. So I could pull out examples. Well, I write a lot about making your own luck. It's something I feel strongly about. I think that we have so many levers at our disposal to create opportunities for ourselves. And we need to think about what they are. I'm a huge fan of taking little tiny risks every single day in order to open up the field of possibilities. Usually if you take a little risk, the pain point of doing something, if it doesn't work out, is pretty low, but the upside might be really high. Whether it's reaching out to someone you want to meet, or trying to solve a problem that seems really difficult, or learning a brand new skill, taking a little bit of a risk, you end up really becoming much, much luckier. And on that note, one of the others is, and I think I spent some time with the students last week on this, is the idea of 1% and doing 1% better every single day, that those people who do 1% every day better, it ends up, if you're just doing 1%, I'm sorry, let me back up. If you're just doing exactly the same job every day, that is 1.0. And 1.0 times 1.0 times 1.0 times 1.0, at the end of the year, you've got 1.0. But if you do 1% better, that is 1.01 times 1.01 times 1.01. After 365 days, that is 38. So if you do only 1% better every day, at the end of the year, you are 38 times further along than if you stayed put. This is totally, this is, compound interest. This is totally profound. And I could keep riffing on this because I tell my students all the time, when you get a job, you are not getting a job, you're getting the keys to the building. And so just like that 1%, if every day you do a little bit better, the opportunities that you end up finding are truly remarkable. And I am personally a living example of this. I'm like a unicorn at Stanford because I basically take this so seriously, and the opportunities that have come to me as a result have been, people look at me like, how did you make this happen? And it's just because every day I do 1% better. And what are those 1% things? People might be wondering, what are those? Well, it's like writing thank you notes. It's like meeting one more person. It's doing one more lap around the block. You know, it's these little things that dramatically shape your life if you just do a little bit better every single day.
You've got a kindred spirit. One of the people Zooming in today is a colleague at the Melbourne Business School called Kwong Lim, and he is continually telling us student entrepreneurs, stop trying to boil the ocean. You know, little steps, little steps. So I think we're on the same page. Maybe a final question. You mentioned the last mile program at San Quentin. And I remember we spoke about it last time we got up face to face. And I noticed that one of the mantras of the course is bond before building. And I just wonder how, you know, you get people to bond. You've got people who are in a pretty serious prison, I guess, and you've got students from Stanford. They appear to have very little in common. What's the recipe for getting them to bond?
Well, you know, one of the things that I think about all the time is, and when I work with the men at San Quentin, is, you know, how would you feel if you were judged by the worst thing you had ever done? You know, these are people who many of them have been in prison for 20 years for a crime that they committed when they were 17 or 18 years old. They are incredibly regretful. They grew up in a very, very difficult circumstance. And you hear their stories and they tell you, you know what, hurt people hurt people. And they tell you that they didn't have any, you know, they didn't feel like they had other choices. They've now gone through 20 years of punishment, of reflection, and they're really ready and eager to join society. And so the students are eager to understand the system and to help these guys rebuild their lives. So one of the things that I think about often as a teacher, and it's one of my favorite quotes about teaching, is that nobody cares what you know until they know that you care. And so just as you're talking about the bonding between these students, I feel like it's my job as a teacher to do the same thing. And it's about building relationships. I mean, think about it, Colin. You know, most of the information that we teach, you know, it's a commodity, right? You can learn it online, you can read a book. Why do we go to school? We go to school because we want, and why are we mourning the fact that we're not in school? Why are we mourning the fact that we're not in our offices with our colleagues? Why are we mourning the fact that we can't see our friends? Because that connection is what makes us human. And so it's super important to build those bonds and those relationships so that people are poised and ready to learn.
The quote you just gave, you know, imagine spending your life being judged by the worst thing you've ever done. How did the prisoners, as they're coming through the last mile program, deal with it? I mean, that is such a compelling idea and such a such a constraint.
I heard from them. You know, that was a line quoting one of the men at the prison. He said that to the students. He said, you know, how would you feel if you were judged? You know, everyone, like every time they look at you, it's like the worst thing you did 20 years ago, as opposed to all the hard work that you've put in since that time, trying to repair your life. I think it's, and many of these people are in for nonviolent crimes that you know, they really are regretful of the things they do. But I have to tell you, a number of the men have told me that being in prison was the best thing that ever happened to them. It forced them to get out of that terrible environment and gave them an environment, especially a place like San Quentin that has so many programs and so many volunteers. I think there are 3,000 volunteers who go to San Quentin each year. So they have so many programs to help them rebuild their lives.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have. All the time we have for questions. Just before we go and just before we say goodbye to Tina, I did just want to acknowledge a few people who've been involved in putting this workshop together. The original idea to have Tina deliver the oration came from the Menzies Foundation and their CEO, Liz Gillies. And so thanks to Liz and Sarah Jenkins, the Marketing Operations Manager at the Menzies Foundation, and Peter Jobling and the board of the foundation for helping to make all this happen. Caitlin Sharrett from the Wade Institute was incredible help last week in organising the workshop. My colleagues at the Melbourne Accelerator program have also been incredibly helpful. And Tim Bright, the MAP events manager, who I know many people on this call know. And what you won't know is my internet dropped out about 2 minutes before we're about to start. So we had to be creative with some constraints before we could even start. And of course, the final person to thank is Tina. And you know, this has been a conversation that's taken a while to come to fruition, I guess. But you know, Tina, thank you for all the support, energy, insight that you've brought to the planning and delivery of this event. Thank you on behalf of all the people who've been involved in putting this event together and your help to all of us. And a very big thank you on behalf of the many, many people who will leave the 2020 Menzies Oration both informed and inspired by your presentation tonight. So thank you very much, Tina.
You know what, it is such a pleasure. I was supposed to be coming to Australia. I was so looking forward to it last March, and I really do hope that I get a chance to visit at some point soon. It has been a true honor to participate. The team has been wonderful, and I am truly honored to have been invited to participate in this program.
Thank you, Tina. So we'll say goodbye to everyone and see you soon in face-to-face, we hope.